If you're another consultant from Bell, save us the speech. The bird flies fine on the ground. Walk yourself back to the gate, ma'am. Major Owen Jackson said it loud enough for the whole hangar to hear. That was the point. 6 maintainers were within earshot in Bay 3. Wrenches paused, and he wanted every one of them to watch him turn the new arrival around before she reached the aircraft. 9 days he had been the face of this failure. 9 days of phone calls he did not want to take. He had decided that the next person who walked onto his line, uninvited, was going to be a story his Marines told, instead of a problem he could not solve. Behind him, side number 734 sat with its cowlings open, an AH-1Z Viper that had not flown in 9 days. The most lethal attack helicopter the Marine Corps owned, 2 engines, 4 blades, a 30mm cannon slaved to the gunner's helmet, and it could not lift off the deck without trying to spin its own tail out from under it. 3 civilian engineers from Bell, a Tiger team from Marine Corps Logistics Command, his own department around the clock. Everyone had touched it. Nobody had fixed it. The grounding had a cost, and the cost climbed every day. The squadron was 12 days from a deployment workup the wing would not slip, 11 aircraft on the schedule, and only 10 that would fly. A combat-coated Viper sitting on jacks was $31 million of taxpayer money learning to grow weeds. Every morning, the maintenance status board went up in the ready room, with 734 still circled in red, and every morning, a colonel somewhere up the chain asked a question Jackson did not have an answer to. He had started taking those calls standing up by the window, with his back to his own Marines, because he did not want them to watch him not have the answer. A man can only stand at a window with his back turned for so many days before the thing he is hiding from walks up onto his flight line, wearing a worn green flight suit. She had arrived the way she did everything, without ceremony. A plain government Suburban had pulled up to the hangar apron at 0725, and she had stepped out of it alone. No aide, no entourage, no clipboard-carrying staffer to announce her. She had stood for a moment in the cool morning and simply looked at the flight line the way some people look at the ocean, taking the whole of it in at once. The rows of Vipers and Hueys, the fuel trucks, the wind, before she ever took a step. Then she had walked toward the one aircraft on the ramp with its cowlings open and a maintenance stand parked beside it, because the broken one is always the one with the stand, and the broken one was why she had come. The woman did not argue. She set her helmet bag down on the painted line. She had a tool roll under one arm, a worn green flight suit gone soft at the elbows, no rank on her collar, no name tape on her chest. 41 years old. Blonde hair pulled back tight and flat. She looked at the parked Viper, and Jackson waited for her eyes to do what every visitor's eyes did, slide to the cockpit, the rocket pods, the gun. They did not. She looked at the tail. She read the tail boom first, then the rotor head, the way a person reads the spine of a book before the cover. Then she did something nobody had given her permission to do. She reached up and ran 2 fingers along the trailing edge of a main rotor blade tip cap. Slow, feeling the surface like a line of text in the dark, and her face registered something the way a doctor's face registers a pulse. Master Gunnery Sergeant Wade Pomeroy stood at the tool crib 20 feet away. 53 years old, 28 of them in H-1s, his name on a Marine Corps plaque in a hallway in Virginia for exactly this airframe. He had logged 10,000 contractors and tourists and inspectors through this hangar over the years. His grease pencil stopped. 2 spots down, a UH-1Y spun up, and the rotor wash rolled across the apron in a hot, flat wave that pushed a man's trouser legs against his shins. The woman stepped half a pace sideways without turning her head, and the wash went past her, and she never broke from looking at 734. She had not glanced at the spooling aircraft. She had felt it coming and moved out of its path the way other people blink. Jackson did not see it. He had already turned toward the ops shack, a phone pressed to his ear, the matter closed in his mind. "Tell the colonel the recovery's on track," he said into the phone. "We've got it handled in-house. We don't need any more outside help walking around my flight line." The woman picked up her helmet bag. She did not walk to the gate. She walked to the ops shack to sign in. Pomeroy set his grease pencil down on the counter and did not pick it back up. "Now who," he said, very quietly, to no one at all, "taught you to walk a line like that?" He had spent 28 years learning the difference between people who had been around aircraft and people who had lived inside them. The first kind learned the rules. The second kind had paid for the rules in fear, and you could see it in the small things, in where their weight went when an engine lit, in whether they flinched at a compressor stall or simply turned to look at which jet had made the noise. This woman had not flinched at anything since she had stepped out of the Suburban. She had walked across an active flight line full of turning rotors, the way most people walk across their own kitchen in the dark, knowing where everything was without having to see it. Pomeroy had met exactly that quality 3 times in his career. 2 of those people were dead now, and the third had a star. He did not say any of that to anyone. He just watched the ops shack door close behind her and started, quietly, to wonder. The next morning she was back at 0900 on a stool beside the bird, asking for paper. "Maintenance data packages," she told Pomeroy at the crib, "and the last 3 test cell printouts. The originals, not the summaries somebody typed up after the fact." She named the exact form numbers without a binder in front of her. He had them in her hands before Jackson, 2 benches over, could open his mouth. She read the way mechanics wished engineers would read. Fast where it was boilerplate, dead slow where it mattered, one finger tracking down a column of vibration figures. Somewhere on the far apron, another Viper ran up to full power for a maintenance turn, and she stopped reading and lifted her chin a half-inch, listening. "That one's fine," she said, almost to herself. Before the run-up gauge inside the shack could have told anyone the same thing. She heard the engine's health in the layered whine the way a tuner hears a flat string. Then she went back to the page. She turned a page, registered the windsock at the far end of the line backing around to the west, and shifted one boot so a taxiing Huey's wash arc would never reach her. Pomeroy watched her do it without looking up from her work. He had seen 3 people in his life read wind like that off a sock and a smell. All 3 had wings. "Every fix on this aircraft went after the tail rotor servo," she said. It was not a question. "Because the data says servo," Jackson said. He had come over. Cold this morning. Not loud. Hands in his flight suit pockets. He had decided to let her hang herself on the same rope as the last 3 teams. "Yaw fault, tail rotor authority, servo." The Bell engineers agreed. The Tiger team agreed. 4 sign-offs. "The fault only shows at out-of-ground effect hover," she said. "Not on the deck, not in forward flight. A servo does not know whether you are in a hover or sitting on your wheels. A load path knows. A load path feels the difference. The drivetrain's been bore-scoped twice and signed off twice." Jackson folded his arms across his chest. "You're reading ghosts in a data file." She turned to page 9 and laid one finger on a single trace. A 1 per rev signature, small, that climbed only above 88% torque and vanished cleanly below it. "Your fault lives above 88% torque and nowhere else," she said. "That is not a control surface acting up. That is something in the driveline taking load and flexing where it has no business flexing. Servos do not behave like that. Steel that is starting to come apart behaves exactly like that." Jackson looked at the trace for a moment. The Bell printout had carried that number the entire time. Nobody had read it as a story about load. "Bring me the test cell tape from the second engine run," she said, instead of arguing. "Not the printout, the raw tape." Pomeroy brought it. She found the spot where the technician had run the engines up through the torque band on the ground, and she traced the vibration channel with one finger as it climbed. "There," she said. "The signature is here on the ground, too. It is small, because there is no air load on the rotor system sitting on the wheels. The instant you put the disc in a hover and load that driveline to lift the whole aircraft, the small thing becomes the big thing. That is why it flies clean on the deck and tries to kill you at 30 feet. Nobody saw it because nobody went looking for a load story. They went looking for a servo, because a servo is a part you can hold in your hand and replace. And a cracking driveline is a thing nobody wants to be the one to write down." A few of the maintainers had drifted closer to listen. Jackson noticed them listening, and he did not like it. "Put it in writing," he said finally. "We'll take it under advisement." She took a pen and wrote the torque number on the back of her hand. 88. She had written numbers on her hand since flight school, when a grease pencil on skin survived a sortie better than paper. She would not forget this one. She wanted him to think she might. The signature she had circled sat on page 9 of a maintenance report. At the bottom of page 9 was a signature block, and the name signed in it was Major Owen Jackson's own. The maintenance brief was at 1300, and Jackson ran it like a stage he had been waiting all day to stand on. 40 maintainers filled Bay 3, standing in a loose horseshoe around the workbenches. He walked them through the Viper saga, 9 days of it, and when he reached the new arrival, he made her the punchline. "So now," he said, "we've got ourselves a Bell consultant, going to read the bird's fuel control like tea leaves. Read its palm. Tell us its star sign." The room laughed because he wanted it to, and because he signed their proficiency evaluations, and a laugh in a hangar is cheaper than a disagreement. Then he turned on Corporal Talia Rios. She was 22, a power plant's mechanic, 3 weeks on the line, still learning where the coffee was. A fuel control discrepancy had surfaced in 734's logbook, and Jackson rolled it downhill onto the youngest person in the room, because the youngest person in the room could not roll it back. He slid a corrective action form across the bench at her and told her to sign it. Rios looked at the form. Her hand did not move toward the pen. Signing it put a maintenance fault in her permanent record, the kind that follows a young Marine from duty station to duty station for a decade. The woman in the flight suit stood up from her stool. She did not raise her voice. She crossed to the bench, put herself between the corporal and the form, a single quiet step that the room felt more than saw, and she asked one question. "Who pulled the fuel control?" she said, "and what date is on the chit? Because it is not hers." The bay went still. Jackson knew the answer, and the answer was bad for him. The control had been pulled and reinstalled 2 shifts before Rios ever laid a hand on the aircraft. The date on the chit proved it in ink. Rios looked up at the woman, then at the date on the chit, then at Jackson. The math was plain to everyone now. The control had come out on Friday's night shift, 2 crews back, signed for by a sergeant who had transferred the next week. Rios had been on a different aircraft entirely. The form Jackson was holding would have made a 22-year-old carry another man's mistake for 10 years, and the only reason it had nearly worked was that the youngest person in the room is the one least able to say no. "That is pending review," Jackson said. He took the form back off the bench. Then he found the only ground he had left to stand on. "And you have no standing in my hangar. None. You are a guest here, and guests do not run my briefs. You want to be useful, you can wait outside by your government car until somebody from Bell calls you back." A couple of the senior staff sergeants exchanged a look. They had been in long enough to know the sound of a man defending himself with rank instead of facts. But none of them said anything, because none of them knew yet what Pomeroy was beginning to know. And rank in a hangar at 1300 on a Friday is still rank. The woman said nothing more to the room. She wrote one line in her notebook where no one could read it, and she sat back down on her stool. "Watch this happen, and then tell yourself it is rare. It is not rare. All over the world, right now, the person who actually fixes the broken thing is being laughed at by the person who broke it, and the room laughs along because the loud man holds the pen over their evaluations. If that tightens something behind your ribs, then you are exactly the kind of person this story was made for. Hit subscribe and stay with her, because it turns, and it turns hard. The corporal kept her record clean that afternoon, saved by one question from a stranger whose name she did not know. Nobody in that hangar knew it. The woman closed her notebook. She looked up. Her expression had not changed at all. Over the weekend, Jackson stopped working the aircraft and started working the system, because the system was a fight he knew how to win. Monday morning at 0800, the pass clerk in the ops shack would not meet her eyes. "Major Jackson's office flagged it Saturday, ma'am," the clerk said, and slid a new badge across the counter. Escort only, stamped in red. Her name had been moved to a watch line in the visitor log, the line reserved for people the command wanted tracked. And there was a fresh entry in 734's logbook, a FOD violation, foreign object debris, a length of safety wire offcut found near the aircraft and traced, somehow, to her. It was initialed by Jackson's company first sergeant. On paper, overnight, she had become a hazard on the flight line. Jackson was not even in the building to enjoy it. He had set the whole thing in motion on a Saturday from his phone and let it run on its own through the duty section, which was a colder kind of attack than the loud kind, and a smarter one. She read the badge. She read the log entry twice. Then she leaned over the counter and read the aircraft's full data plate from memory, serial and bureau number both, and corrected the clerk without any heat in her voice at all. "Bureau number 167-4-911, she said. "Your log has it entered as 4910. Fix that today, before somebody signs off a flight on the wrong tail number, and we are all standing in a different kind of room." The clerk fixed it on the spot, and looked at the woman a beat longer than before. The way you look at someone when a small thing they have just done does not match the story you were told about them. A contractor flagged for a safety violation does not carry an aircraft's bureau number in her head to the last digit. A contractor does not catch a transcription error that could put a crew in the wrong jet. The clerk did not know what she was looking at. She only knew the picture had a crack in it. It was a smart attack, and she knew it for what it was. A loud man can be answered in front of witnesses. A quiet stack of paper, built over a weekend through the duty section, is harder to fight, because it doesn't have a face to look at, and it doesn't have to be true. It only has to be filed. She had watched careers end this way. Good ones, buried under chits and flags, signed by people who never had to stand in the same room as the person they were burying. She had no intention of being buried under 734. She had a debt to that aircraft's whole bloodline that a red badge could not touch. She did one thing of her own that morning, in writing, in her own clipped hand. She typed a request for a borescope kit and a full intermediate gearbox, drive shaft coupling inspection that she would conduct herself. She routed it through Pomeroy and copied it to the commanding general's maintenance officer, so the paper would exist in 2 chains, not 1. She signed it the way test pilots sign a flight card, initials and a date code, and nothing wasted. The signature of a woman who had signed 1,000 of them at altitude. Then she pinned the red escort-only badge to her chest without a word of complaint and turned to Pomeroy. "I need an escort," she said. "I'll escort you, ma'am." He said it before she had finished the sentence. "Wherever you want to go on this flight line, I will walk you there myself." The forged FOD chit sat in the logbook, needing exactly one more signature to harden from an annotation into a formal incident, the kind that generates an investigation of its own. There was a blank line at the bottom of it, waiting, and a pen clipped to the cover of the book directly above it. By Tuesday afternoon, Pomeroy had stopped watching her and started asking about her. He took the landline in the back of the tool crib at 1500, where the compressor noise covered a quiet call, and he dialed a master sergeant he trusted at the Marine Aviation Weapons and Tactics Squadron in Yuma. He described what he had been watching for 3 days. A woman with no name tape who read a tip cap with 2 bare fingers, who heard a healthy engine 300 yards off and called it before the gauge did, who walked a hot flight line like she had poured the concrete, who found a load fault on page 9 that 3 teams had stepped over. The line went quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is somebody deciding how much to say. Then the voice in Yuma came back, changed, low and careful, and a little afraid. No rank, no name tape, worn green suit, reads a tip cap with 2 fingers. Here's engines. A breath. Wade. Brother. Do you have any idea who is standing in your hangar right now? I was hoping you'd tell me, Pomeroy said. I'm not going to say the name on a base phone, and you'll understand why in about a week, the voice in Yuma said. But I'll tell you this much. We teach a class here. Every Cobra and Viper pilot in the Marine Corps comes through it at some point. There's a case study in it about a coupling lot that should have killed a lot of people and didn't. The instructor pilot who runs that block does not use slides. She just stands up front and walks them through one morning over a swamp in Maryland, second by second, from memory. And there is not a sound in the room when she's done. A pause. If that's who you've got, then whatever's wrong with your jet, she already knows. And whatever your major is doing to keep her off it, you want to be on the other side of it before this is over. Get her on that aircraft, Wade. Today, if you can. Across the bay, the woman had climbed into the front seat of 734. Just to feel it, she had told the crew chief. A young mechanic named Pharaoh stood at the nose and watched her hands instead of her face. They moved without a checklist and without her eyes ever dropping to find them. Collective friction set. Throttle rolled to the detent and held. Force trim release pressed under her thumb at exactly the spot it lived, in exactly the order a real start runs. Then the engine condition levers. Then her thumb finding the starter. 1,000 starts had built that sequence into her hands, and her hands ran it in the dark like a prayer, said so often it no longer needs the words. There was a thing test pilots and combat aircrew shared that no manual could give a mechanic, and Pharaoh was watching it without a word for it. The cockpit was not a place this woman went to. It was a place this woman came from. Her hands did not search the panel the way a student's hands search, hunting and confirming. They arrived. Every motion landed where it was going before her eyes would have had time to send them. You did not build hands like that in a simulator or a classroom. You built them in the dark, at night, over water, with the gauges lying to you and your own life riding on whether your fingers already knew the answer. Pharaoh turned to Pomeroy, who had just hung up the phone and was standing very still, with one hand flat on the workbench. "Top," the kid said. "How does a contractor know where every switch in that cockpit is without even looking at them?" Pomeroy did not answer him. He went to his reference binder instead. He pulled the Cunningham Award roster, Marine Aviator of the Year, and he pulled a fleet-wide test bulletin from 2019 about a grounded lot of drive shaft couplings. He laid them side by side. He matched a name to a call sign to a face he had been escorting around his own hangar for 3 days. Then he closed the binder fast, the way a man closes a hatch on a fire. Here is the question worth carrying with you into the next part. A woman 3 teams of engineers could not outthink is being escorted around her own service's flight line like a trespasser, wearing a red badge with a forged violation in the logbook. And an old chief who has seen everything just went pale on a phone call about her. Why? If you want to find out at the exact moment Jackson does, subscribe and stand in that hangar and wait for it with the rest of us. In Yuma, the master sergeant set his phone down, looked at it for a second on the desk, and then picked it back up and dialed a number with a Pentagon area code. That night, she was alone in a bare visiting officer's quarters room, and for the length of one part of this story, the camera goes inside her head, because it is the only way to understand the rest. The borescope kit lay open on the desk under a single lamp. She checked the battery, watched the small screen wake and steady to a gray glow, and set it down beside the photograph. The torque number was still on the back of her hand, faded now. 88. The ink worn down into the creases of her knuckles. She had felt this exact vibration once before. Patuxent River. 2019. A test card for an out-of-ground effect envelope expansion. A controlled hover climb on a clear morning. Instruments green across the entire board. She had felt the 1 per rev in her heels first. Up through the pedals. 2 full seconds before any gauge on the panel would admit it was real. She had reached for the radio to call it out to the control room. She never finished the call. The coupling let go at altitude. The yaw came on hard and would not arrest. The pedals gone soft and meaningless under her boots. The aircraft trying to rotate around a tail that had stopped answering. She had bottomed the collective and rolled into auto-rotation over a Maryland tidal swamp, because the swamp was the only thing under her for a half-mile that was not a house or a county road or a school. The rotor had carried her down on its own stored inertia, the way the engineers who designed it swore it would, the way no pilot ever fully believes until the day it does. She remembered the green coming up to meet the windscreen. She remembered the silence after the blades finally stopped, water already at the door seal, reeds laid flat against the canopy, her own breathing the loudest thing in the world. She had walked out of that swamp with 2 ribs taped and a notebook still buttoned in her chest pocket. Then she had written the report. Not the easy report, the one that traced the failure past the airframe, past the maintenance, all the way back to a single bad lot of drive shaft couplings, a flaw born on a factory floor and invisible to every inspection on the books, a crack that lived under the surface where no borescope angle in the manual could see it. The lot was grounded across the entire fleet inside a week. Months later, 2 letters reached her through the squadron, from 2 crews who had flown the corrected aircraft and come home to their families, who would never know how close the arithmetic had run for them. After that morning, the call sign Raven 1 stopped being a joke somebody had hung on her in flight school. It became a debt, and she had been paying it down ever since, 1 airframe at a time. There had been an investigation after the swamp, the way there always is. A board of senior officers in a paneled room had asked her, more than once, in more than one phrasing, whether she had simply over-controlled a healthy aircraft and frightened herself. It would have been the easy finding. It would have closed the file by Friday and embarrassed no factory and no program office and no general's procurement timeline. She had sat in that room with her ribs taped under her service blouse and refused to sign her name to a lie that would have left the bad couplings flying. She had brought the vibration tapes. She had brought the math. She had made grown men with more rank than her sit through 40 minutes of a frequency she could prove only existed if steel was cracking, and she had not raised her voice once because she had learned by then that the quietest person in the room, who is also the most certain, is the hardest one to dismiss. The board had ruled in her favor. The lot was pulled, and she had learned the lesson that had governed every day since, which was that the truth does not need you to be loud. It needs you to be right, and to refuse to move. A coupling does not care how many times a major signs it off. A coupling cannot read. It cannot be persuaded. It only counts cycles, and it only fails once. 734, she understood now, sitting in the lamplight, had far fewer cycles left in it than anyone in that hangar believed. She looked at the 88 on her hand. The same failure. A different mask. A different tail number. 800 miles and 7 years away. On the desk, beside the borescope, lay a folded photograph. A swamp at dawn, a four-bladed tail rotor standing upright in the reeds where the boom had broken. On the back of it, in her own handwriting, were 11 names. Wednesday at 1100, Jackson crossed the one line he could not uncross. The commanding general's maintenance officer was due on the flight line the following morning. Jackson needed the drivetrain theory buried, and the woman gone before that visit landed, and he had run clean out of paperwork to do it with. So he came at the problem with his body, the way men do when the clever options run out. For 2 days, she had worked the inspection slowly, methodically, the way she did everything, building the case the aircraft could not build for itself. She had pulled access panels with Pomeroy at her elbow, and a corporal logging every step. She had run the borescope down 3 different paths to reach the coupling from an angle the manual did not call out, because the manual's angle was exactly the one that hid the crack, and she had known that since a swamp in Maryland. Jackson had watched it happen from across the bay with a growing understanding that the thing he had buried on Tuesday was about to be dug back up in front of the general's own maintenance officer, with his signature on the page that buried it. She was up on a maintenance stand with the borescope probe fed deep into the tail boom, into the intermediate gearbox drive shaft coupling area, the small screen cupped in one hand and glowing against her face. Jackson came across the hangar hot, loud again, the way he had been on the first morning, except now there was a thin wire of fear running under the loudness, and the maintainers could hear it even if he could not. "Corporal," he said. He pointed at Rios, who had the bad luck to be standing nearest the stand. "Remove the contractor from my aircraft. Now. That's an order." Rios froze. The order was wrong, and every Marine in the bay knew it was wrong, and the knowing hung in the air like fuel vapor. To put hands on the woman was to lay hands on a guest of the commanding general. To refuse the order was to disobey a major in front of 40 witnesses. The corporal stood caught between the two. 22 years old, 3 weeks on the line, a wrench still in her back pocket. The woman solved it for her before it could cost the corporal anything. She had already seen on the screen what she had climbed up there to see. She came down off the maintenance stand one-handed, the borescope cradled against her body, her boots finding the rungs without her eyes going to them, every motion the plain economy of a person who had climbed into and out of aircraft her entire adult life. She was standing on the concrete before Rios had to take a single step toward her. "Stand down, Corporal," she said, before the order could trap the kid. "I'm coming down on my own." On the ground, she stepped clear of the wash arc of a Huey, starting up 2 spots down, again without turning her head to look at it, reading the change in the air on her skin and her ears. And she held Jackson's eyes the entire time she did it. 40 maintainers had stopped working. The bay had gone quiet enough to hear the rising whine of the starting bird outside. Jackson had just ordered a junior Marine to lay hands on a woman in front of every one of them, and the order hung there in the open now, where it could not be taken back, where it could be written down. He had needed her gone before morning. Instead, he had handed her the cleanest thing she had collected all week, and the worst part, the part he could see beginning to dawn on the faces around him, was that she had let him do it. She had stood up on that stand and waited for him to walk over and do it. "You followed a lawful-looking order," she told Rios, low, just for the corporal, just under the rotor noise. "Write down the time. Write down what was said and who said it. That is all you have to do. You did nothing wrong here today." She had what she needed now. On the small screen in her hand, fed back through the borescope from deep inside the tail boom, she had seen the thing every prior inspection had missed, the thing the manual's borescope angles could not reach, a hairline of darkness running across the intermediate gearbox, drive shaft coupling exactly where the load math said it would be. She had photographed it. She had time-stamped it. The aircraft had finally told its whole truth to someone who already knew the language. Everything after this was paperwork and a flight, and she had done a great deal of both. Then she turned back to Jackson, and for the first time since she had stepped off that Suburban onto his line, she smiled. It was small. It was almost private. It was almost amused. The smile of someone holding a card she had not decided yet whether to play. Jackson saw the smile, and for the first time on his own flight line, in front of his own Marines, he did not know what it meant, and not knowing frightened him more than anything she could have said. At 0700 on Thursday, the Huey came in low over the perimeter fence and flared onto the pad, and the whole morning rearranged itself around it. The intermediate gearbox drive shaft coupling had come out overnight on her finding. Pulled under lights, inspected, replaced, the work signed off before the midnight shift went home. 734 was signed up for a functional check flight, and the commanding general of the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing had flown down himself to watch his most expensive grounded aircraft go back into the air. 2 stars stepped off the Huey and onto the concrete. Jackson moved to meet him, already talking, already shaping 9 days of failure into a recovery he had personally led. "Good morning, sir. The teams brought her back around. We ran the fault to ground and we—" The general walked straight past him. He walked past Major Jackson in the middle of his own sentence, as if the man were a traffic cone left out on the taxiway, and he crossed the line directly to the woman in the worn flight suit, standing at the nose of 734. He stopped 1 pace short of her. He brought his right hand up into a salute that every Marine on that flight line could see clearly in the early light. "Raven 1, the general said. "Good to have you on my flight line." Behind him, quiet, to the maintainers who still had no idea what they were looking at, Pomeroy said the rest of it out loud at last. "That is the Patuxent River test pilot who grounded the entire lot back in 19. Walked out of a swamp and wrote the report that saved every Cobra and Viper crew flying that variant. Her report is printed in your own course book. You have all read it. You just never once saw her face." Jackson's face moved through its stations one at a time, the way a damaged engine runs down. Confusion first, that the general had not stopped for him. Then disbelief, his eyes going to the missing name tape, the soft elbows of the flight suit, the bare collar. None of it adding up to the word Colonel. Then recognition, slow and sick and total, as the worn green suit rearranged itself in front of him into a person whose name was taught at the very schoolhouse he had graduated from. Then horror, plain and complete, with nowhere to put it. "Colonel," he said, I didn't. Nobody told me." Nobody had to tell you, Major." The general said it without raising his voice and without turning fully around, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. "She handed your shop the answer on Tuesday. I have read your logbook on the flight down. We are going to have a long conversation about what you did with it, you and I, and the Inspector General, and it is going to start the moment this aircraft is back on deck." He let that sit. "Lieutenant Colonel Kessler runs the H-1 division at the weapons school. Before that, she ran operational test for this exact airframe. The reason your course book has a chapter on driveline failure is that she wrote it with her own 2 ribs. You had the most qualified Viper diagnostician in the Marine Corps standing on your flight line, and you gave her a red badge and a forged FUD chit." He finally looked at Jackson. "Step back from the aircraft." She returned the general's salute, crisp and unhurried. Then she pulled her own helmet out of the bag she had carried in past Jackson on the very first morning, glanced once at the functional check flight card, and read the first item off it aloud to the crew chief by its number, the way she had read 1,000 cards before, and walked to the cockpit. She opened the door without putting any weight on the hinge, settled into the front seat, and ran the start sequence the kid named Pharaoh had watched her ghost in the dark 2 days before, every switch finding her hand in its order. Both engines lit and caught. The rotor came up to speed and smoothed out into a single clean disc. She took it up through the torque band, slow and deliberate, the way a test pilot expands an envelope, watching the channel that had told the whole story on page 9. Past 80%. Past 85. Past 88. The number that had lived on the back of her hand for a week. The number where the old aircraft had tried to spin. Nothing. The tail held. The disc stayed clean. She held it there in a steady hover and let everyone on the line watch the gauge sit quiet at the exact value that had grounded the jet for 9 days. She lifted 734 into an out-of-ground effect hover. 20 feet. 30. Clean and square and steady. No yaw. The tail holding exactly where for 9 days it had fought to spin. The aircraft 3 teams of experts could not fix sat in the air above their heads as if it had never been sick a single day in its service life. She brought it back to the deck softer than a man sets down a glass, ran the shutdown without a wasted motion, and climbed out. She did not look at Jackson. She walked to Pomeroy first, and to Rios standing beside him, and she handed the corporal the functional check flight card with one line written across the bottom of it in her clipped test pilot hand. Rios read it. Rios stood a little straighter. 2 military police and the general's own aide walked Major Owen Jackson off the flight line, while the rotor he could not fix turned clean and steady in the sky above all of them. The reckoning came fast, the way these things always do once the first true thing gets loose in the open. The Inspector General's officer pulled the logbook by that afternoon and laid the documents out on a table in a row. "The FOD chit is a forgery," she said flatly. "The wire offcut was never bagged or photographed, and the pass downgrade has the major's name on the routing slip in his own initials. The drivetrain finding is the colonel's, dated and time-stamped, before he ordered a corporal to physically pull her off the aircraft. This is not close. This is not even an argument." The first sergeant's initials on the fabricated chit went into the file directly beside Jackson's. The trespass order he had drafted was voided before it was ever served on anyone. The coupling was the proof that mattered most, the proof that did not care about rank or reputation. Under a laboratory glass, the hairline crack in 734's intermediate gearbox drive shaft coupling matched the failure pattern from the 2019 lot exactly. The same flaw, the same geometry, surfaced again in a production batch nobody had thought to question a second time. On Kessler's word, the squadron pulled every other Viper on the line and inspected every coupling by hand. They found one more cracked, in an aircraft scheduled to fly a training sortie the next morning with 2 crew aboard, and they caught it cold on the ground. There was a quieter finding underneath the loud one, and it was the one that would follow Jackson the longest. The investigators went back through 9 days of logbook entries and found the moment the drivetrain theory had first been raised, on day 2, in writing, page 9 circled, and they found it stamped, received, and then marked closed, without action by the major's own hand, inside the hour. He had not merely failed to fix the aircraft. He had been handed the answer on the second morning by the one person who knew how to read it, and he had filed the answer away, because the answer came from a woman in an unmarked flight suit. He had decided in advance was nobody. The grounding had run 7 more days than it needed to. 2 more crews had been one cracked coupling away from a swamp of their own, and the only reason they were not was that the nobody had refused to leave. Major Owen Jackson was relieved of his maintenance billet pending the investigation. The man who had spent 9 days protecting his reputation lost all of it in a single sunrise, and not to her. He lost it to the aircraft itself, which had been telling the truth on page 9 the entire time. And Corporal Talia Rios, who had refused to let her hand move toward a pen in a crowded hangar, was moved into a power plant's leadership track on a written recommendation signed Raven 1. The fuel control discrepancy was struck from her record. The date on the chit doing the simple work the truth always does once somebody finally stands still long enough to let it. The recommendation Kessler wrote for her ran a single paragraph, but it was signed by a name the power plant's chief recognized the instant he read it, and it carried more weight than 10 pages from anyone else on that base. It noted that Corporal Rios, given an unlawful-seeming order under pressure in front of 40 witnesses, had neither obeyed it blindly nor refused it loudly, but had paused, thought, and protected the integrity of a maintenance record at real cost to herself. That, the recommendation said, was the single hardest thing the Marine Corps ever asks of a young maintainer, and Rios had done it on instinct in week 3. The kind of instinct you cannot teach, the kind you build a career around. You log the truth, Kessler told her before she left, even when the loud man is standing right there signing the lie. That is the whole job, Corporal. There is nothing else to it. And you are going to be very good at it. If you have ever been the quiet one in a room full of louder, lesser people, and you waited, and you let the truth do its slow and certain work instead of shouting back into the noise, then let her stand in for you tonight. Subscribe to Honor Tales and stay with us for the next one. Pomeroy found her at the tool crib before she left, with the binder still under his arm. He did not make a speech. Men like Pomeroy do not. He set a fresh grease pencil on the counter in front of her, the kind he used to mark blades, and he said only, "Caught it on day 2, ma'am. We just weren't smart enough to listen until Thursday." She picked the pencil up and turned it over once in her fingers and put it in her chest pocket, and that was the entire conversation, and both of them understood it completely. At dusk, she stood alone on the perimeter taxiway, her helmet bag at her feet, and watched 734 lift into a clean hover against an orange California sky. A young crew at the controls now, the tail holding dead true. The light went long and gold across the apron and turned the aircraft into a black shape with a turning halo, and for a moment, it was every Viper and every Cobra she had ever signed off. Every crew that had walked back to the ready room because a coupling held when it might not have. Every name she would never be told. She looked down at the back of her own hand, at the bare, worn skin where a torque number had been written and had finally faded away. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She only pressed her thumb once against that patch of skin, the way a person touches a scar to be sure it is still there. Her secure phone buzzed once against her chest. 3 lines from an engineer she had flown test cards beside in another life, now consulting for a procurement office, an ocean and 6 time zones away. Raven. Sky Talon vibe spectrum is wrong. Ankara. Friday. She read it one time. She closed the screen, and she stood there on the cooling concrete and watched the Viper fly. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.